Welcome to the resource tracking and deployment module. So what is resource tracking and deployments? Well, resource tracking and deployment is really used to track the status and location of resources, like equipment, goods, and services really associated with an emergency event or an incident. Now, usually what happens is that logistics unit, and within the logistics unit, either the procurement branch or if activated, the resource tracking unit, will end up tracking resources that usually need to be tracked, such as those things such as equipment, people, and services. The resource tracking unit does not track consumable goods or otherwise, but it does track non-consumable goods if required. And just to keep a note, when tracking resources, it's very important to work with the operations section to understanding the deployment of those resources. So you'll be working kind of hand in hand with both operations to understand where the resources are going to and otherwise. And so you can kind of capture and track information until we can kind of get it back into their operational hands so it can be redeployed, as necessary. So in order to locate any of the resources that need to be tracked, well, if you log on to VanORCA, you can go to the Resource Tracking Deployment tab. There's an ability to see any of the existing tracking entries or logs. You also have the ability to update by selecting one of those and edit it, or create a new entry. And then there's also those deployed locations of where they essentially have been deployed or planning to be deployed. So when you create a resource tracking and deployment log, what's going to happen is the form is going to open up. You can relate this to a resource request if it's required, or you can, if you need to deploy existing resources that we have in the city that we own and maintain, then it allows us to also track and deploy those resources as well. But if it is related to a particular resource request, we want to make sure that we want to track that, we can end up asking the question, and you can select the resource request that it's related to. You can enter any of the resource deployment details, so the resource is being tracked. So we want to provide information that's related to that and provide the content for that. We want to put the deployment status, so whether it's being ordered, delivered, returned, extended, or otherwise, and any kind of deployment comments as necessary. We want to enter the quantity that's been deployed, so the numeric value, and also the deployment date and where it's being deployed to. It's important to put in the deployment contact information, so the responsible person who is responsible for tracking this resource, so somebody within the logistics section, the resource tracking unit, or potentially the procurement unit, and then also who deployed it, so who's deploying the resource. And then any sort of vendor contact information if it's applicable. Now, when we're getting the items back, then we can end up putting that information in. So, have the resources been returned? It's a simple yes or no question. If the information is yes, they have been returned, and whether we're deploying 2 or 4, you put in the quantity that has been returned, and any sort of return comments, so whether they've been damaged, whether there's needs more work on the existing resources, or if they're in fine-tune and they can then be redeployed again, as necessary. And then we end up saving that information as kind of part of the record. So a couple key points to remember. The resource tracking board is really used to track the status and location of resources, including the equipment, goods, and services associated with an emergency event. The procurement branch, or the resource tracking unit within logistics, creates those resource tracking entries for resources that need to be tracked. Usually it's going to be equipment, people, or services as necessary. And the procurement branch, the resource tracking unit, you will also update the resource tracker and will need to work closely with operations and kind of tracking those resources. So also give a brief demonstration of what all this looks like as well. So I've logged on to VanORCA. I can end up going to the Resource Tracking and Deployment tab. And in here, I can end up seeing any kind of entries that I have or have the ability to create. I'm going to use an existing one already to kind of walk through that process. And there's also shows a map down below of those deployed resources. So in this case, I can select on that record. It's going to open it up. And in this case, it has some details. It's asking me the question if this was related to a resource request. I did answer the question to be yes. There is a simple yes or no. If it is no, you just select no. If it is, then you can end up selecting the associated resource request. You can only select one. So in this case, it's this particular resource request around generators. So in this case, it provides me all the kind of the details around that resource request, which is very helpful to provide reference information. Right, and so in this case, this particular resource request is really looking at 600 kilowatt generators on a sound attenuated trailer. It's basically like a semi-tractor, and usually 4 of them. And then there's shows information around who this particular resource is going to be reporting to on the site, the section that created it, and a few other details, the vendor contact information, and a few other things that can be used for reference information as kind of part of this. I put in the overall deployment details. So I want to enter in the resources being tracked and any additional items that might be necessary. So in this case, the 600 kilowatt generator, sound attenuated trailer, it's basically a semi-tractor. The deployment status of that. So in this case, I can walk through whether it's being ordered, delivered, returned, extended, or otherwise. In this case, I have delivered it out. I don't have any deployment comments for this, but if I did, I can enter that information in there, as necessary. The quantity that I deployed, and then the deployment date, and then where it was being deployed to. So in this case, it's going to Strathcona Park. The site contact actually is going to be the person who's going to be receiving it. So in this case, I can make that adjustment actually, and then actually I'm going to report to Guy LaRue. So I can type in Guy L. And then deployed by, if I was in the procurement unit, then it's going to be deployed or within operations. I can put in my deployment contact details in there. You can put in the vendor contact information, that being United Rentals, it's a phone number, and then I can end up saving that record, as part of that. These items haven't been returned yet, so they're still deployed out. They're still in operational use. And then if I was going to update that record, so say for example, those resources are going to be returned, I can go back into that existing record, as necessary. I can scroll down to the bottom, and if there are items that haven't been returned, I can make that update. I can put the quantity in there, and I can make any comments, as necessary if there's any damage to the existing resources or otherwise. And I can put that information in there, as kind of part of that record. And then what's going to happen is it's going to update the status to be returned. It's going to say the items have been returned, quantity returned. So I have a match, coin deployed, coin returned, 4 and 4. And then that concludes how to create and update any resource tracking and deployment logs. Thank you.